is Todd Kimball, and I am your MC today. It is an honor and a privilege to be with you this morning. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. But before we get to that, we have our reader, the lovely Ann Henderson.
That I know you all know, at least you know the first two lines of it. It's called It's If by Rudyard Kipling. And I just ran across it the other day and I thought, you know, it's something that everybody needs to think about. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowances for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hate, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and pick them up with worn-out tools. If you can make your one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and to hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings and not lose your common touch, if neither fears nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a human, my son.
Thank you, Ann, for a lovely and timely reading. Our speaker today, Meghan S. Martin, is the executive director of a local conservation and research nonprofit, PDXWildlife. The organization consults and researches worldwide on captive breeding programs for giant pandas, African painted dogs, black-footed ferrets, Hawaiian birds, Caribbean iguanas, blue death feigning beetles, my favorites, and Asian elephants. She is also an adjunct professor at Washington State University, Vancouver, where she teaches animal behavior and human anatomy and physiology. Meghan wholeheartedly believes in her nonprofit's motto, conserving species through research, community education, and science. And she shares her passion for conservation with us today. Let's have a warm yet muted welcome via Zoom and a rousing ovation from the Friendly House for Meghan S. Martin.
Hi guys, thanks for having me, and thank you so much for inviting me to your lovely talk today. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so we can start my presentation. I'm going to share with you just a portion of my work today, and at the end I'll kind of give you an overview of what new projects we're going to be doing and sort of what PDXWildlife does in general. But this one I like to lovingly call panda speed dating because it's sort of what PDXWildlife is known for. I've become what I like to lovingly term a sexpert for endangered species. Yeah, I wish I could put that on my resume. I guess it's maybe not super professional. But I have become known for introducing sort of mate choice and natural mating methods back into conservation breeding of endangered species. So I travel the world teaching zoos and conservation endangered species programs how to incorporate those methods into their breeding program so that we can increase the breeding success of these wild animals in captivity, and then introduce more back into the wild once their habitat is secured and we feel comfortable with doing that. But also for insurance populations so that we don't see these lovely animals go extinct. So that being said, because I do a lot of breeding research, you will see some rated R content, nothing that you wouldn't see on National Geographic or anything, but I like to warn audiences if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. Let's set the stage here. The animals that you're seeing go across your screen have all become now extinct in the wild or extinct entirely within the last 20 years. The IUCN just listed that more than 1 million species, you may have seen this go across the headlines of newspapers in 2019, but it's projected that in 20 years, more than 1 million species will go extinct. So that's the very, very dreadful future and scenario that we're dealing with as conservation biologists. This is a lot of work for a very limited amount of biologists that are in this field, right, if we want to save all these species. And there's multiple threats coming from all sorts of different areas. But to give you an idea, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the IUCN, or the International Union of Conservation Network. If you hear this term endangered, the animals can be listed via the IUCN, which is an international society and nonprofit organization. And they actually started trying to put like a science to classifying animals. So we start on your right-hand side with animals of least concern. That means the animals have been evaluated scientifically. Their population is not declining. They're doing fine in their current environment. And then as you move to extinct to the left, you're getting more and more threatened. There is these 3 categories in the middle that are considered threatened. And those are where you'll hear endangered or critically endangered. So near threatened is they're starting to decline a lot. And they have numbers for all of these things, so if you want to go look it up, very technical numbers like, losing more than 10,000 individuals in a year and habitat shrinking by X amount, right? So they have very scientific definitions for all of these. The yellow, you get into what's called vulnerable, so your population is really starting to decline. I don't know if everyone saw, the monarch was just declared endangered by this organization, which is a huge thing. It opens up funding for national and international conservation for those species. And then the CR is critically endangered, so the population may be less than 200 individuals, for example. And then you go to extinct in the wild, which is some of the species I work with now are actually extinct in the wild, only exist in conservation breeding or in zoos. And then extinct is, to our knowledge, we haven't seen an individual in some time. So that's where we're at with these guys. All of the threats that we're facing right now, in general, the #1 threat to most species is overexploitation. So we're still, I think the cod fishery is a good example of this, right? The graph you're seeing in the background there is how we started overfishing Atlantic cod. And you can see in the 1970s, we had this huge overfishing sort of event, and the population plummeted because many of these species, until the population plummets, we don't know that there's a critical mass for their population. They'll go out in the ocean and breed. The passenger pigeon is a perfect example of that as well. Most of us thought the passenger pigeon went extinct a while ago, but they need like thousands of individuals in all their flocks to successfully breed, until they started getting overexploited and killed, we didn't actually know that they needed this critical mass for breeding. Same with the cod. They needed this critical mass, so they plummeted, and over the next 20 years, they continued to plummet until they went nearly extinct, and they had to be highly managed. And now you can kind of see the blip in the 2000s where they're coming back. They're also listed on the red list. The second one is habitat loss. And we like to think of Oregon as being super green, right? And we're all really into the environment and saving this. But I took a Google Earth screenshot out just right outside, going out 26 on Oregon towards Astoria, right? So this is near Enright, Oregon. And you're going to see 1984 is the start of the Google time lapse that I made from Google Maps. Or Google Earth rather, and if it plays, hopefully it plays. Here, I may have to push the button. There we go. You'll see the numbers of the years counting down or counting up to where we currently are. And you can see how much deforestation. So even in green Oregon, 2020, we probably lost close to a third of that habitat that existed. And that's even, I feel like that, I was surprised by seeing a local place like that be so deforested in the last 20, 30 years. So even here, we could do a lot better on that habitat loss. And it's because of this that the population of animals are getting really threatened. Oh, and now it's not going to let me advance. Maybe. Okay, there we go. And as you all know and have heard, climate change and pollution, I kind of put these together as one. They have ended up, they're going to be a huge threat in the future. And again, I took a time lapse, I believe from NOAA's website, and we're starting in the same period, 1970, and going through 2020. And you can see how much, 2017. So this is even like 5 years. That was the most recent data they had on this kind of a map. But see how much we've increased in the Northwest even, but like all throughout the globe, we went from being kind of blue. And this is the percent change. So remember how they always talk about, we can't get to the 2 degrees. That's what this is showing, the percent change from that sort of neutral background to this 2% change. And we're nearly there. And they believe that we'll get into a negative feedback loop once we're in that climate change. But all of the species that are affected by this, I think you always have to have that obligatory polar bear on the ice cap, right? So the Arctic species will nearly disappear because that cold weather evolution that they've evolved to be in, that really, really cold environment is going to just disappear for them. And indeed, again, this may be new to you or not, but we have had a couple of main extinctions during the lifetime of the Earth. And you're seeing the peaks of the main extinctions here, but we are currently in what scientists are calling the Anthropocene extinction. So we are projecting with that 1 million species I told you about going extinct, that we're going to be another peak. And if any of you speak Latin, you know anthro is from human caused. So they're labeling it based on our external pollution, changing the environment and raising the temperature of the Earth. So we have officially entered this extinction. Our background extinction rate currently is much, much higher than it was in the past. And we're projecting over the next 100 years that we're going to lose the same percentage of species, up to 76 all the way to 90% of species disappearing or evolving. Yeah, it's big. Not everything will go away, but we'll probably, we definitely won't have those white rhinos and such. But, after being the downer this morning, right? It kind of pulls at your heartstrings. These are species that we've saved from endangered conservation breeding programs. And currently that IUCN, so that red list, has evaluated 8,660 species, and 2,199 are recommended for breeding in the future in order to save them from extinction. So my area of expertise, I project, is going to become very needed in the future. We already are trying to save, I know scientists, like one scientist working on a species, and they're the single reason why they're not going extinct in the wild. So yeah, we're pretty tapped out. But being a conservation and breeding specialist, I also want to put out the numbers right now on conservation breeding programs, right, and why I entered the field. So you already saw that about a quarter of species or more will probably need conservation breeding in order to remain on the planet and be available for future generations. And unfortunately, when I looked at the literature and did sort of a review, I found that most of these programs, 94% were not self-sustaining. So only 6% of the conservation breeding programs, if we stopped breeding right now, or if the species went extinct right now in the wild, only 6% would actually maintain that species because they're replacing their internal population. So if we're breeding a lot and only 6% of them will actually stay alive for more than 10 years, we're actually not going to be able to keep them from extinction at our current success rate. But a recent, and then also a recent study from the zoo, just the zoo world. So the zoo world does a lot of conservation breeding, and they looked at 110,000 different organizations that do this, and they found that only 20% of their breeding recommendations actually resulted in a breeding. So they're also, the zoo is putting lots of money into it, but we're not really great at getting wild animals to breed in captivity. That makes sense, right? They haven't evolved to breed in these little enclosures that we put them in, little, I say in quotes, because a lot of them are bigger, but they're not the 100 miles, 10, 20 kilometers squared that some of these animals have in the wild to breed. So this is when I was a master's student back in 2006. This is kind of where I entered the zoo world and the conservation breeding world. And I just was like, wow, we can do better. So the reason we're having a problem, I believe, is that about 10 years ago, we were breeding pairs. We have these small populations, right? So you don't want brothers or cousins to be breeding, right? We gotta manage them for the genetics of the population. So we were really breeding pairs based on minimizing the genetic relationship of these individuals, right? And I always like to say, you can probably pick someone on Zoom or in the room that's the opposite sex and be like, oh, you're a good genetic match, right? But if I put you in a room together, would you make a baby? I don't know. That depends on a lot of things, right? How much alcohol you've had, if Marvin Gaye is in the background, I don't know. So this was a big problem for me because most species, I kind of was like, well, Darwin exists. People, sexual selection, the evolution. So I'm going to show you, for example, the pygmy rabbit population that I worked with. That is a little population, the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbit population. It went extinct in the wild, and it's in Washington, eastern Washington sort of base. It's this little population that is a subset of the pygmy rabbits from Idaho, but it's been isolated for so long that it has its own special subspecies. It started to go extinct in the wild, and we pulled the last 13 that we knew of. So you can imagine trying to start a breeding program with 13 individuals in the first place, right? And then we're like, oh, only you and you can mate. And so that's what you're kind of seeing. The dots at the top represent the individuals we started with and who we recommended to mate. And you can see how the lines start getting really messy really fast, right? So you'll have second cousins or siblings breeding quickly. But unfortunately, because we were doing it this way, we actually lost, they're called founders at the top. So when we bring animals into captivity, the first breeding wild generation are called founders, and they have the genetics from the wild population that we know of. And we actually lost the representation of a lot of founders because they didn't like the person we put them with, right? They were like, I may be a bunny, but I'm not breeding like a bunny with this bunny. And so my argument is that, is it better to keep some of those genetics and have a less desired genetic pairing, or have those animals actually represented in the future? So let's relax the genetics a little bit and where we're at. The other problem we're having in captivity, which is a direct result of sort of this pairing, is that we often have animals that just hate each other, or they're like blasé about each other. They definitely don't want to breed with each other, right? So we have what's called behavioral incompatibility between the sexes, and then the breeding methods are highly specific. So I put a local species that we know of, right? The sage grouse. I don't know. They've also been declining in the population. They're in Eastern Oregon. They have this really crazy system where for like 2 weeks, all the males in an area come to this spot that's called a lek. And they puff out their chests and they call to females, and one male gets 95% of the breeding. So all the females come to this area, and it's like from hundreds of miles circumference, and they all come to this area, and only one male gets the breeding. And so you can imagine doing the Noah's Ark one-on-one in that situation isn't going to work very well. So how do we set up this lek where all the females can come, and how do you make one male that you really need genetically be the best male in that situation, right? We have to think of all these ways to manipulate the system to make it work in captivity. So you guys came to see pandas. We haven't even talked about pandas yet. I'm going to show you a Nat Geo film of pandas and how they breed in the wild. So the female in the wild climbs to the top of the tree, and the male is being shown right now. The female only goes into estrus for 2 days, so we have a very short window to get these females bred. In the wild, they'll climb to the top of the tree, as you're seeing her do, and you see the male at the bottom, but 4 to 5 males will come and congregate at the bottom, and they'll duke it out for breeding rights. And the winner loses, or gets all of the chances for breeding, and he'll sit there and kind of mate guard the female who's at the top of the tree. And when she's ready, she'll come down and she'll breed. And so that's how they do it in the wild. And these other males will come in. They're showing the other male coming in. And I wish you could hear the stuff, because it's a panda. It's in the front, and the male comes in from the side. This is super exciting, right? Can you see the difference between the wild? Yeah, so she's presenting to him, and this is a really good interaction for us. He's very interested. He's staying there. He's smelling her. She's rear presenting. So fun, right? You can kind of see the difference between the wild and captivity, hopefully, and see that we may have some problems getting these guys excited to mate because we've changed everything. There's not males competing, so they don't have a male-male competition. That may be a way for, the best male to win, the female to choose whether or not she likes the male, or to have the best genetics represented in her sons and daughters. So, there's a lot of things we're removing from the equation, and we are pretty good at breeding them, but like I said before, I kind of was like, what happened to Darwin and sexual selection? And like all of these very complex pictures that we have in the wild and we aren't providing in captivity. So my research started with my master's and looking at the effects of mate choice on reproductive success. I'm going to give you my PhD results. So I did this on pygmy rabbits. It didn't get nearly as much national attention as the pandas did once I repeated it on pandas, but the results were similar, and I'll show you a graph at the end for all of the species I've done since. But my hypothesis was that if I just provided some mate choice, I would increase reproductive success in these species. So we traveled to China, to this little area where the pandas are only now existing. So in the upper right, you'll see their historic range of the giant pandas. They were actually all throughout China, all the way up to Beijing, all the way to the coast, and now they only exist in the little red mountain range, the Minshan and Qinling mountains of China, in the predominantly the Sichuan district, but a little bit more into the other Shaanxi and Ganzhou districts too. We fly into Chengdu, which is this city right here. I'm a little laggy and weird. So I'll like point to it. This city right here, we fly in, and then we travel to the breeding bases. So China has started a large breeding program where they have 3 conservation breeding centers with about 100 pandas at each center. And then we breed for a very short period of time from February to about May, and we do lots of breedings during that time period. And then they reintroduce animals in the fall. So a lot of those breeding animals get trained for reintroduction and then reintroduced into this range. So we flew there. And a little bit about pandas. They're notoriously difficult to breed and motivate to breed in the wild. So when I started my PhD, which started in 2013, we started collecting official data. I kind of looked at what was happening with the normal breeding program from 2012 to 2013, and we did 166 breeding opportunities during that time period, during that one breeding season, and only 20% of them, or 38, were successful. So we were hitting that exact, remember how I gave you that same statistic for the overall zoo community? We were hitting that exact statistic for the pandas, which, if you think about it, is awful. Because, right, even chance is better than that. Like, even if we flipped a coin with the animals and we're like, who's going to breed with who? This was worse. We were doing worse than chance. And pandas are notoriously difficult to breed because the females have this 2-day window, and really they're optimally can be fertilized in like an 8-hour period. So we do a lot of urinary analysis of their hormones to see exactly when they're ovulating, like you do if you're having fertile problems in humans. We do the same thing for pandas, and then we introduce for breeding, or we take them and artificially inseminate them if they're not naturally breeding. So I have a book chapter out that kind of shows what happens for the female breeding. The large black line you're seeing is their progesterone concentration, or estrogen concentration, sorry, at the time. And then the progesterone peak would be right after the estrogen peak, which tells us that they ovulate. And then the optimal mating is that kind of blue high bar next to the peak. So right after the estrogen peak, we try to mate for 2 days. And you'll see that I put like the dashed bars in, and that's where their behaviors start to increase, or certain behaviors start to increase. So about 2 weeks before, females will start to scent mark and call. And that in the past has brought wild males into the area, right? Because they're scent marking and their estrogens are going up. So that's chemically can be detected by the male, and they can come in and congregate and then do this male-male competition. So you see I kind of put in right around like 3 days before breeding, the males will compete all through the breeding, and then they'll breed, and then they'll go on their merry way. So that's what happens. What we did is we went in and we set up what's called a dichotomous choice test. So this is very scientific. Now you guys get to learn some slang, I guess. So I wasn't at panda speed dating at this point in my life. I was like, let's just give him the choice between two males, right? And so we basically put the female in the middle and we put two males on either side, and you measure the behaviors. And we measured the behaviors for 30 minutes. It's pretty clear who she likes, and half of my females got introduced to the preferred male and half got introduced to the unpreferred male. And we stayed within the genetics of the population, so we managed the genetics and just chose the two best males genetically. And we measured preference by more than 60% of their sort of mating behaviors being directed towards one male. So, you can see like the little female like maybe goes, and then we introduce the males for mating. And, I kind of simplified it for you because what we actually had was sort of this U shape where we can put the animals into the different pens. We can shift them across the entire U. So we would alternate male, female, male, female, male, female, male, female, right? And we could shift any of these animals across. And what that allowed us to do is simultaneously measure the male preference and the female preference. So some males had two females on either side. So we could see who liked who. And do that. And when I talk about behaviors, there are some like very interesting panda behaviors that we have that I think a lot of people don't know about, right? Because you usually see them eating bamboo, which is probably about 90% of their time. But the males during breeding season and the females get a lot of these very interesting behaviors. And the males do this thing which I call the escalated leg cock. So they do leg cock like a dog, where they get on they urinate on, the hydrant or whatever. They'll do that, but they'll escalate that behavior, and they actually do a handstand and then pee as high as they can possibly get. And we think that in the wild, maybe because she's in the tree, or we think that maybe it's because when they're doing this, they're advertising to males how big they are, right? Because the higher you can get, like bigger body you have. So that's our working theory on that. But they'll do all sorts of scent anointing, urinating, leg cocking. They do lots of vocalizations, which I like to play for people because, you'll see. I'm going to be quiet again. So the female is in the front here, and the male is in the back, and they're introducing her for breeding. And they do this call called the bleat. It sounds like a goat, which is why we call it bleating, because it sounds like a goat. And this is a really affiliative call. It means that they like each other. She really wants to breed with them. The other vocalizations we'll hear are chirps, and you'll hear why we call this a chirp in a second. Can we hear it? Yeah, I call this the come hither call. So the female will go, and the male, that'll be to call the male over. So you see that the male's not there, and she's wanting him to come and interact. So it means the female's really into the male. And the males they'll also do this moan, which we call the Chewbacca call. Can we hear the male? You can barely hear him in the background. I think the next one has a good moan. So this one is an actual breeding of Lulu, one of the best breeders at Chengdu in the Bifeng Sha base. It gets a little, oh no, this is actually Haize. It gets a little like growly at the end because he actually was rescued from the wild, and he has a leg that was caught in a trap, so they had to amputate the leg. So you'll see that in here, but you'll hear the Chewbacca call in here too, and the barks and growls. They have very similar to dogs, because they're a bear. Yeah, so that was the bark and the growls. They were actually at the end of their 2 days, and she actually loved him, but he couldn't get purchased, so we were trying to move him around a lot and give him logs to stand on and stuff like that, but he couldn't, he wasn't successful because of his leg. He couldn't, get purchased to do it. So she was understandably getting a little, annoyed that it couldn't happen. Yeah. Yeah. And then the other things we'll measure is social, so tell up. They do what's called lordosis, so we see this a lot in mice and stuff, but they kind of bend their back and put their rear end really high. It puts them in the best position for fertilization. And they'll back walk and they'll present their genitals for the males to inspect. So here's what I would call a positive pre-mating behavior in captivity. So we would have introduced that pair. And I'll show you some results pretty soon, but I wanted to emphasize that we never put in the super aggressive. So if we're seeing them bark and growl at the what we call howdy introductions with these little gates, we will never introduce the pair because they're too valuable to risk them dying in captivity. So my non-preferreds were more like these guys. They were blasé. So in a way, scientifically, we had already subsetted out the most aggressive negatives. So some of the data you're seeing isn't actually representing even the captive population because we've removed the super aggressive out of it. So these guys, you'll hear the Chewbacca call, the moan. We hear that a lot when they're like, I'm just not sure about you. It sounds like Chewbacca. And they went on like that for 30 minutes, right? Just moaning at each other and being like, I don't know, I'm not going to leave you, but I don't really like you being in my space. And so then we mated them, and then we recorded additional stuff like mountings, time until intermission. Intermission is just a fancy way of saying copulation. And then the total time that they actually copulated. And this, you guys are super lucky because you're going to see portions. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but portions of the world record panda mating video. So this mating he held on for 17 minutes. Which I think he just actually the same bear recently broke the record.
And I was waiting in this tub. Male correct, female correct, thrusting correct.
Is it rolling it? I can't even see about the first of it.
There we go. Yay!
See how excited I get about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Are people watching all around?
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Are people watching all around?
Yes.
Oh, that might be a little disconcerting for them.
Yeah. So I actually think it is, and that's a great question because I have a follow-up paper coming out where I started recording how many people were around because I started noticing the shyer animals. So that same question took me off into this whole side research project that I did on personality and how well each personality bred in captivity, because I noticed the females that were shy would completely shut down. So we weren't getting breedings from them, but the keepers didn't know that that's what was happening because I would be there early watching behaviors before everyone showed up. And then I would be like, she's an estrus. And they would be like, American, who hasn't watched pandas for a long time. And then we would miss their estrus. And so I just started collecting the data for them and telling them. And then after a two times when they missed estrus, then they were like, oh, maybe she's seen things. But yeah, so there can be, I mean, one time we had National Geographic there and it was like 60 people. So they have these, you can tell I'm doing it from the top. We have these upper walkways where we can go. And that's actually to facilitate getting them, like separating them very quickly if they need to. So they'll like kind of separate them from the top or like throw apples down into different areas to get them away from each other in the pen. But yeah, so I started recording how many people were around each one because sometimes we'd have only like 2 people, me and the manager, and sometimes we'd have up to 30 people with whole cameras and stuff. Lulu definitely did not care. He was like our prime breeder. But as you can imagine, some people are exhibitionists and so is Lulu, right? He just doesn't, he knows he has that job and he goes in there. But yeah, it's very, very interesting to be there. And like I said, this one, he actually held that rollback position. So that's what we're looking for. You probably heard the bleat where he was like, and I got all excited because everyone knows when they do this extended bleat, we actually have now defined it in the literature. We call it the orgasm bleat. So that means that he's successfully penetrated, and the longer they hold, the more successful the breeding is. I don't know if it actually correlates to more of a pregnancy or not, but I think we looked at that data and it actually does not. But that's what we're looking for, is them holding this, what we call a rollback position. So he just kind of rolls her back onto his lap. And so we watched and recorded a lot of breedings. You saw that we would record the breedings, but also we would do a mate choice for weeks leading up to that. So we would do our dichotomous choice tests every day until the breeding happened. And we recorded a lot. And I had the keepers call me if they saw any breeding. So we had a lot of jokes internationally. I did this while my daughter was 9 months old the first time she came to China. She lived for a quarter of her life until 5 years old in China at the base, and got to feed the bears and record. We'd give her a recording sheet with crayons and she'd pretend to record as well. They eat a lot. We recorded a lot of bamboo eating. That's me in the background, and this is that same male that I was showing you before who was missing a leg, so we tried to get him into multiple different places. That's Lulu again, super happy. We did a lot of these introductions where we just measured their behaviors and saw a lot of breeding. And then part of PDXWildlife is providing internship opportunities to the next generation and providing connection through these international experiences so that they can make connections and become international scientists and collaborate like I collaborate across all of these different societies. I feel like that really enhances our science, having the different cultural perspectives. So the bears also watched us at the tops of trees, but my interns would stay there. We brought in interns and trained them every 3 months, and they stayed for 3 months. So we'd have about 15 interns per year in these groups for 3 months, and they'd stay and they'd watch, and they'd get really cool experiences with the pandas and in China. And then, hiking around towards the end, most of them would also experience the Chinese culture. This area is very rich. It has the largest Buddha in the world in the Sichuan district. Lots of temples. It's very close to Nepal, so it's the area that you can, access Nepal through too. We recorded audio and fecal. We did lots of simultaneous studies, not only the behavior, so that we could see what's happening physiologically as well. Some of our interns were super lucky and got to train because they were zookeepers from America, so they would train and help the Chinese in their training methods and learn operant conditioning and just how we do it in America versus China. So there was a lot of good cultural exchange happening. We now teach them, do welfare classes with them and such, the Chinese too. This is the reintroduction area. So you may have heard that the Chinese make you wear panda suits so that the animals don't get, and they're scented with panda scent so they don't get used to how humans are if we have to go into the cages. The cages are huge. They're multiple acres to 20 acres, so they're really big. Chances of the panda seeing us are slim to none. I rarely saw a panda in the actual enclosures, but just in case, we always wore these panda suits, and my interns wore them with us. We thought we looked a little creepy, but they look a little bit more. And then this is my daughter. We were watched a lot culturally. I have a redheaded daughter. So this is her walking by a school. And you can see the crowd. She was the only, Caucasian redhead. And red is a very lucky color in China. So I would come home. She actually would cause traffic jams where the police had to be called because they would go into the street. But we'd come home and she would have mandarin oranges, lollipops, little pieces of money shoved into her clothing. I think she got kind of a big head. And then we waited. The whole point is these guys, right? The babies were so cute. They are unique too in that the panda produces the smallest baby to the ratio of the mother. So they come out the size of a stick of butter. They look like pink rats, and they squeal a lot. But I think one of the reasons they're so charismatic is because the moms, the pandas have these opposable, they're not thumbs, they're a metatarsal bone. So this part has grown into like a thumb, but they can hold things like we hold things. So they very much, the baby relies on the mother for thermal regulation for the first month. So she has to almost consistently breastfeed and hold the baby. And within 3 months, they look like this. So they go from that to these really roly-poly, very charismatic cubs just running around, mouthing on the bamboo, climbing into trees. They love to climb in the wild. Traditionally in the wild, they will sequester up at the top of a tree to hide from predators while mom eats down below. And they'll just sleep for a long time at the top of the tree and come down to play at night. So you can see that they're just beautiful creatures. I understand why they pull disproportionately at our heartstrings. Yeah, they're just so cute. And the mom and baby relationships are super special. And every once in a while, I get the chance to actually hold one that's going to go into the conservation breeding program. So now you get to see the results of all of this work. I've been doing this now for 15 years. We've kind of gone offshoots on this research, but this is my Ph.D. research. And I'll explain the graph a little bit. So the y-axis, or the vertical axis going up, is the percentage of matings that we had that were successful versus unsuccessful. So the green bars are going to be your intromission success, and the blue bars are whether or not there was a cub produced. And then going along the x-axis, you'll see I said non-preferred, non-preferred. So NP stands for non-preferred. And then the first one is that the female preferred whether or not she preferred or not. And then the second, the one after the dash, is whether the male also preferred that female or not. So you can see non-preferred, non-preferred. We had 0 success in those. And those weren't even the ones we never even got a chance to breed, right? Those were the ones we actually were like, they were blasé, but we put them in anyways. And then they just didn't ever breed. And then you can see that we got up to 50% if one of the partners preferred the other. So we got a little more success if the male preferred the female. So that's the the third bar area over. in the intermission success, but not much. But we hit that 50% coin toss, right? Like, let's get one of them to prefer, and then like maybe it's like a toss-up whether or not they'd mate. But if both of them preferred each other, we got our success of intermission and cub production up to 85% for intermission, and then of those 85%, 90 of them had cubs. So this is huge, right? If we can get this to translate across all of the, and here's the numbers just for those of you who are familiar. So I did like the little interaction table for you, but again, it's just 0% up on the non-preferred, and then, sort of into the 50s for those mixed groups, and then 83 and 90% for success rate. Oh, sorry. So we published this, and it turns out everyone loves panda sex. So I spent a month just after I'd finished my PhD doing interviews with Reuters, Science, National Geographic, IFL, which is I fucking love Science, which I feel like is the top of my career once I've gotten interviewed by them in a way. I read them all the time. The Smithsonian, we actually hit like the second page of the New York Times. So basically everyone was like, oh my gosh, if pandas love each other. It was quite the eye-opening experience for me after coming from pygmy rabbits. But yeah, so to put this back into sort of the view that we saw at the beginning, right? If we had 80% at the beginning and only 20% success rate, now we've literally flipped that on its head, and we're at 83% and 17% for the different success rates. And I have hence gone and tried to get lots of different species represented on this exact same program, and you can see, so the kiki is an endangered bird in Hawaii, which a lot of them are. There's only 500 left in the wild. So they've pulled a population in. You can see with them it matters even more, 0%. So I'm going to tell you the lighter colors are sort of the preferred and the darker colors are the non-preferred. So the green will be our breeding and the blue will still be our whether or not we had offspring produced. But like for this, for example, the akikiki here, if we give mate choice, about 97% of them will breed, and then half of them will have babies. But if you don't give mate choice, none of them do. The iguanas is a little more mixed. We still have some success, but again, we have more breeding success. Butterflies seem to matter the least. So the insects, I mean, I only have one, but it doesn't seem to be as big of a deal, but we still got a significant increase in breeding success. Pandas mattered a lot, and then the pygmy rabbits, we only did the offspring success, not the breeding, but they mattered a lot as well. And off of this, we went into, so probably one of the things you took from the video is that we have no male-male competition, right? So in the wild, we have competition, but in captivity, we don't, and we've removed that entirely. In fact, the Chinese actively manage them to not have the males interact. And so it took me a really long time, 5 years, to convince them that I wanted to see if we could give the males competition only through that howdy gate, so it was a protected competition. But if we like simulated competition in their environment, that there was this other male around that was interested in the female, would that increase breeding success? Because one of the problems we have is that we have really good males like Lulu that you saw, and we have really dud males that never breed, but we need their genetics. I think personality is happening there too, but I think some of them need this male-male competition. So again, I went back to China for my postdoc. I did this with the San Diego Zoo for 5 years, and saw whether or not competition would increase breeding success in the males. And here's some of our top breeders. We have Pan Pan, who now passed away. He actually, about 75% of the captive-born pandas can be traced back to Pan Pan. So he was similar to Lulu, and Lulu is the other, he also has a huge representation in the population. So we're starting to have problems because these males are overrepresented, even if we can get them to breed to different females. So we went back, but what we did is we measured the female's mate choice before competition, and then we moved the female inside so she couldn't see, and then we moved the males next to each other and let them compete. And then we moved them back, and then we measured female preference again so that we could see her preference before competition and potentially how much behaviors the males were doing before competition and how much they were doing after competition. So they had sort of this internal control, but we did this with some males and we didn't do it with other males during the breeding season. So we kind of had simultaneous presentations, and I'm going to show you one of these. So that was Taishan, and I believe Bai Yang. And Taishan on the left is actually an American-born panda. And at this point, I had watched him for almost 10 years, and he had been given breeding opportunities and never bred. And then after we did our experiment, you'll see in a couple of slides that we were actually able to what we call rescue non-breeders. So some of the males who had never bred ended up breeding that same season because after the competition. But we saw in general that locomotive behaviors went up, chemical communication went up, and social and sexual behavior went up after we did the competition. And then, as you would imagine, since they're doing those behaviors a lot, they weren't eating or feeding or, drinking water or sleeping quite as much. So some of their general behaviors went down. And we found that he's so happy I had to put that picture in there. So, you'll see that I'm not that professional some of the times. So here my control group, so the males that did not get competition are in your blue, and the green is the males that got competition. And you see that the intermission success was much higher for the males that got competition. So 75% of the males that got competition had intermission success, whereas only about 37% of the other ones didn't. It didn't quite affect cub production and whether or not the baby was reared by the mother, but we didn't necessarily expect it to affect those things, especially since the female didn't see the competition. Some of the post-fertilization mate choice that can happen by the female, since she didn't see who the winner was, that we didn't necessarily think that would be affected. But it was nice to see the intermission was affected. And the interesting thing is, too, we've never seen these competitions. We've only seen them in the wild, but there were entire behaviors that we had never seen these males perform that we were able to put on our ethogram and now see. So it's kind of nice to get more representative of wild behaviors that are happening. He's doing a foot scrape in this one that we had never seen before. We also have never seen this kind of yawning behavior. So during the competitions, the males will gap their mouths really wide, and it looks like they're yawning, but they do it really consistently. I don't know if it's a stress because they're in an uncomfortable situation. Dogs yawn when they're kind of stressed out, or if it's a way to show how big they are again, right? That they're showing their teeth and how good of a competitor they'll be in the future. But yeah, they did it over and over. So we saw some of these new behaviors. That was cool. And then we looked at who the winners or the losers were between the male competition and how well they did in intermission success. And it turns out the winners also do better in the intermission or having breeding success than the losers did. So that was pretty interesting. So I hope we're getting to the end here. I hope you guys take home from this that, mate choice and male-male competition really increase reproductive success. I hope that you guys are inspired to help me continue this research on future species So I now do a yearly workshop that's open to conservation breeding in the zoo world. So conservation breeding managers come and they learn these methods from me. Last year and the year before, because of COVID, we held it virtually, but we're hoping to take it to the in-person conference next year. We have a current study going into the social systems of more complex group animals. So we're doing a study on the breeding behaviors of African painted dogs that we have here in the Oregon Zoo. So we'll collaborate with them as well. But Oklahoma City Zoo is my main partner on this one. We are also getting into, I hope, on the next slide. I don't know if you guys will see it because I'm pushing the button, but it's not advancing. There we go. The salamanders and amphibians are taking a huge decline here in the Northwest. So I'm hoping to start an internship program and a salamander population study of their behaviors and potentially expand that into conservation breeding with the Oregon Zoo as a partner in the local Northwest species. So I'm excited about, sort of bringing a lot of this research back into Portland and helping the species here that may be in trouble as well. The butterflies were also at the Oregon Zoo, so we have partnered with them. And we're studying, I heard someone say that they are fans of the fainting death beetles, but we're studying these every year and how they're being affected by, their breeding may be affected by extreme climates because they already live in a pretty extreme climate in the desert. So we're doing temperature experiments in a captive population at Washington State University, seeing how their breeding behavior may be altered and their whether or not they have more intromission or more breedings with extreme temperatures on either end, to be honest, since climate change is making both ends of the spectrum extreme, both to the cold and to the hot. So those are our future projects. Any of those of you with smartphones can take a picture of the screen and it'll take you to our website if you want to, but it's also PDXWildlife.org if you want to see some of the stuff we're doing. We're on Facebook, you can follow us. Questions? I'm all done.
Meghan, that was outstanding, incredibly informative. I've been a member of the Portland Humanists for over 15 years now, and I can honestly say that I saw visuals and I heard noises that I had never heard at the Friendly House before.
That's what I'm here for. I think most of my talks, it's not hard to talk about pandas. They're so unique in so many ways.
I invite our live audience to raise their hand at the Friendly House, and either Jeff or Mike will bring a microphone to you. Our Zoom audience knows to type your name in the chat, and then you can come online and ask your question, or you can type the question in the chat and I will read it. This was a topic that I knew nothing about coming into today, so I have a number of questions, but I'll only ask them as needed as we wait for other members. But I will start with the first question, a basic question I had. These male competitions for the pandas, how do you know who the winner is?
Again, we kind of had to, come up with our own thing because we hadn't, in the wild, it's whoever backs off. So I kind of took the same thing, so I measured who was kind of growling the most and who retreated. We measured retreats a lot. So who retreated from the fence the most often. And then we designated the winner based on those two behaviors mainly. So like who was growling and like barking and really, intense at the gate, and then the other one would back off and usually go circle and may come back for a little bit more interaction. But yeah, they break up a lot. And the retreaters, it feels like I could have probably just measured retreat and we would have been able to know based on that. Because as you can imagine, the loser would be the one who's like, I'm not gonna fight anymore. Yeah.
I figured that our resident psychologist in the group would have a question. Let's go to Hank Robb in our Zoom audience.
Hi, Hank.
Wow, so many questions.
Yeah.
First of all, with regard to the competition, did the winners of the competition, if I heard you right, then the females get to pick again. Did
Well-
they change who they were picking based on the competition, or did the winner of the competition typically be the one that they wanted to begin with?
I am analyzing that data right now. So I can tell you I do not know because we just got all of this finished right before COVID. And so we kind of asked our bigger questions, behavior, were the control versus experimental group of just the male-male competition and the ones not provided, were they different? And now we're getting into some of those like more minute questions. Because that was one of the reasons I wanted to measure it is, sort of are the males changing their behavior before and after? And then are the females changing their choice based on that behavior? My gut, and from the very first take at the data, is that the females change. I think it's more because the males start interacting more, right? So the winner starts getting more interactive because he thinks that there's another male there that's going to take the female. So they start like being more motivated to breed. And so I think they start soliciting the female a lot more, and then the female changes her behaviors based on that.
And could I ask one more?
Yeah.
Can you tell if the males multiply ejaculate so that the longer that they are inserted, the more sperm they're producing, or is it sort of a one-shot deal?
Based on the vocalization, I think that they do multiple, because that orgasm bleat will have peaks throughout. So I think if he holds, right, like so he'll do it at the very beginning, and then they'll kind of like settle down and like not as much, and then they have another peak. But unless we were to break them up, like I don't think there's a way to measure. We can take swab samples of the female afterwards to see if ejaculation actually happened. But again, like I said, my gut is to say that they multiply just because of that orgasm bleat. We have like studied the audio of it with an expert from Australia, and it is distinct from their normal bleat. So my gut is to say it's multiple. But
Well, I have more questions, but I'll go to the back of the line.
yeah.
Well, thank you for that last question, Hank, and thank you for that answer, Megan. I'll tell you, I was at a party last night where panda ejaculation would have come in very handy.
I know. Next time, I know I always win the like happy hour conversation. I almost feel bad, right? When you're like, "What do you do for a living?" I always make sure the other person goes first because I'm like, "I study ejaculation in pandas," right? It's not hard.
Joyce Lackey has a beautiful Portland background there. I'm sure there's some endangered species in that background. Joyce, unmute and ask your question.
This kind of work is fascinating for a number of reasons, but I have two questions, and I'm usually not a naysayer. I'm really positive about the kinds of things we're finding out, but I tend to wonder. You mentioned the extinctions, and having read the sixth extinction and looking at where we are in the Anthropocene age, I have two questions. Do we have enough time to even worry about this? And number two, looking at species individually like that, aren't we missing some of the interaction of the species? In other words, we can maybe bring one back, but we don't bring back the ones they need to survive. Or is that making any sense?
Yeah. So the way we handle it in conservation biology, because you're absolutely right, if we just focus on a couple of species, we're only going to save those species. However, the ones we're focusing on is what we call umbrella species. So if we get the panda, who is a charismatic animal, right, they live in bamboo forests, that also will incorporate all of the species that live in that bamboo forest, if that makes sense. So I think right now, because as a conservation biologist, you're a perpetual optimist and simultaneously a pessimist, I think. I don't have any faith that we're going to stop habitat destruction or climate change. I think my job should be paid more and more people should be doing it, because I do feel like we're going to have these insurance populations until people wake up, right? So we're going to lose a lot of species until we start having the humans affected by all of this stuff, and then we'll start to be like, oh my gosh, we shouldn't have like lost all of this habitat, and we'll start fixing it, but we need the species to be somewhere, and then once we start to fix the habitat, we can then start reintroducing them. So for me, I feel like I'm going to have a lot of work to do in the next 30 years until people wake up and a lot of humans start dying. And then, after that, I'm going to, hopefully humans will wake up, and then we'll be able to fix it. But again, I think a lot of us conservation biologists are concentrating on those umbrella species, the large charismatic ones that people care about. And the idea is that conservation will hopefully spread to, the red panda is in the same habitat, the takin is in the same habitat, and there's giant river otters and normal river otters in the same habitat, not to mention all of the like birds that they have there. So the bamboo forests are very rich in biodiversity. So, if you kind of get the one animal that everyone's behind, you still save all the other animals through that habitat restoration of that one. So yeah.
Isn't that true of the elephants?
Yep.
Aren't they an umbrella species?
Yes, they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I think we just, you pick and choose your battles. Yeah. I'm not saying one is more important than the other. I love baby ram pandas as much as I love the pandas. But giant pandas bring in the money. I mean, the salamanders are not making me anything. Right. I've got to tell you. I hate it because I think they're just as charismatic. I love freaking salamanders. Their little smile. I think that they're so freaking cute. But the money, money talks and donors talk. And yeah, elephants. I had one of my professors in undergrad tell me, if you can link your research to saving the whales, then you can get funding on anything. And it kind of has been the truth, right? Like my pygmy rabbits, I did the exact same research on them. I don't think anyone blinked an eye. And then I made, freaking New York Times with the pandas 5 years later with the same PhD research. The same story, basically, but pandas drew a lot more attention. So yeah.
Our next question comes from our club president via Zoom from Vallejo, California today, Mr. David DiNucci.
Hi, David.
Hi. Hi. So yeah, thanks so much. And I think Hank already asked my questions mostly, but I'm going to ask maybe it more specifically. Mm-hmm. At one point you were, at the beginning, you seemed to be measuring the success of a mating by the length of time that the male was engaged. And then later on, I think you said that you hadn't definitely assured that actually was a measure of success, that the length of time might not be. So that was just an assumption going in that you would measure later on. And or did you have a reason? I guess Hank's question that maybe if there's multiple ejaculations during that time, that would suggest there would be more success.
More success, yeah. So the beautiful thing of like collaborating with the Chinese is they have all of these cultural assumptions coming in, and I have all these cultural assumptions coming in, right? And they often differ. Like they think that it's very bad for the pregnancy if the females are given ice, for example. And we give ice all the time in the US as an enrichment treat. But that comes from their human perception that the females should not have ice. So when I came in, they were all of the Chinese were like, the longer the males hold the intermission, the more successful it is. And I was like, well, really? Like, where's the data, right? So I just started measuring it because who knows, right? To me, that kind of didn't make sense as a US scientist, because it's like we are taught, it takes one sperm. So, I mean, the more you put in, possibly, but, the data just wasn't there. So I measured both whether or not they actually had an intermission, so kind of a 1-0 yes or no question, but at the same time, I measured the length. And now I'm starting to get to amount of data that I can look at it, and we did look at it, and the length doesn't seem to be a factor, but that doesn't mean that if we couldn't measure if there were multiple ejaculations, like the question before, right, that may be a factor. I didn't measure at the time. We didn't really know about the orgasm bleat, and so that kind of only became apparent sort of along the line, right? So I'd have to go back to my video and put in those oh, I think this was another ejaculation. Because it's possible you hold for a long time and there's only one ejaculation in there, right? But it's also possible that you hold for a long time and there's 5 ejaculations, and that could cause a difference. But I didn't measure that specific one. Did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I'd have to go back to my video, my hours of panda sex video.
Our next question comes from the Zoom community and Kathy Moyd.
Hi, I was involved in the California condor breeding program at the LA Zoo. I was a nest box observer when they first brought them all in from the wild, and what we would do is we would watch, and if the bird was in the box at sunset, then the keepers would know not to do their regular routine that might disturb them, and the next morning there'd usually be an egg that they could then snatch.
Yeah.
And they would usually do that for 2 eggs. But then the other thing they were interested in was, the condors are a bird species that actually both sexes take responsibility for for taking care of them after they're born. And so they would give them, after taking the second egg, they give them a fake egg.
Mm-hmm.
And we would keep track of, when they switched, when the incoming bird would roll the egg for thermal. And so it was concluded that they were actually likely to be good partners. So they eventually started giving them Andean condors, and then finally let them start raising their own chicks. And so I'm wondering, is that something that your program is also concerned with? I know with the pandas, it appears that the mothers are pretty well.
Like typical mammals, the pandas have only maternal care, but that's very typical of birds. And the kikiki had biparental care. And my gut and what we saw in the kikiki is that the mate choice mattered even more in that situation, right? Because when you were choosing a mate in that pre-breeding period, so they do sort of courtship displays and choosing mates before their nesting period, which is usually February to May as well. But they'll choose a mate from November to February. And we found that for them, the only successful pairs who would sit on the nest, form a nest, sit on the nest, and then lay eggs and raise fledglings were the ones that were the preferred pairs. None of our non-preferred pairs usually even got to the nesting phase. So I think for biparental species, mate choice matters even more, because you're choosing a partner who's going to successfully help you raise the babies too, and your babies are going to be successful if you choose a bad partner.
Yeah, I think ours were already paired off when they came in.
Yeah.
And I kind of know that there was no bird in the box if I saw all 4 of them, all 4 pairs that were in my one enclosure up on their roofs. But
yeah.
And there was one bird called Topa who had been in captivity for a long time and was of definitely a separate genetic line, and so they really wanted to breed him.
Yep.
And they first put in an older female, and she intimidated him. But then they gave him a sweet young thing, and
he was fine with it.
When they sent out, they always sent out a little pad of paper with a picture, kind of picture,
They would have. Yeah,
picture, and it was a condor smoking a cigar.
yeah. Oh, cute. Yeah. That's definitely. So I'm trying to get the zoos away. That's why I've started working with like the larger zoo, national zoo, conservation breeding programs. Because I'm trying to get them away from this idea of like Noah's Ark and trying to move them to like a hub model. So most do what you're talking about, which is they try to pair a certain male and female they really want together. And then if that one doesn't work out, then they like ship that, the female away, and then they'll bring in another female. But that's what I term sequential mate choice. So you're not simultaneously evaluating two mates, right? You're just rejecting one or the other. And depending on the lifespan of an animal, like pygmy rabbits, they did the same thing. But if they only breed for 2 years, we don't have the luxury to like move animals in and out that much, right? Because if they don't like the 1 year, then you've lost that year of breeding. And then if they don't like the second year, you've also lost that year, and then you never have a breeding. So I'm trying to get the zoos to come to an idea where the larger zoos will house, like koalas are a good example we're working with right now with San Diego. They already have like 30 koalas at San Diego Zoo, and it represents probably 70% of the entire zoo population. And so they would be the hub for koalas, for example, and we would pair the koalas there first, giving them mate choice. And then a successful pair would be sent to a zoo. So you'd still kind of have Noah's Ark, right? But you would like pre-set them up for success. And it would make the whole process like faster. You wouldn't have to ship different animals in between zoos, because even shipping across the country, like animals die pretty consistently like that. So I'm trying to get them to this like idea of what I am starting to call a hub, a breeding hub. And then you still get, individuals out at the zoos breeding and making babies for the public, but you kind of do the hub thing, send them out. And then when you're done with those genetics, you send them both back and maybe pair them with another female, like give them choice between a couple more females, and then send them back that way.
In our case,
Kathy, I'm gonna leave it there for you.
Just let me make one sentence that we had 8 pairs at the LA Zoo and 8 pairs at the San Diego Zoo plus Toka, and so I suspect that the one that with the successful mating was probably one of the chicks born at the LA Zoo.
Yeah.
So probably. there was no moving anybody around.
Yeah.
Our next questioner is known for his unique and challenging questions, so I'm really looking forward to this one. Let's go to Al Christians.
Yes, Megan, you seem to have a real good big picture of the situation with animals, but the food chain for animals always goes down to plants.
Yep.
I heard of an important seed bank at University of Oregon that got shut down because, Oregon State, that got shut down because they lost their funding. You say the pandas get the money. Wouldn't it be better to spend money on plants so that the animals can stay alive too?
I mean, I can tell you there's so much more money that I would put to different things than pandas. Unfortunately, we're not the ones making the decision. You guys are. Right? Like if you care about plants, then that's where the donation goes. And I'm all with you. We have the same seed banks for mammals and, or just all species. The Smithsonian has a genetic bank for species because they're starting to get into a whole different field of science called de-extinction, right? So they're starting to be like, we just have to bank these genetics so that at some point we can do the Jurassic Park thing, right? I'm with you. I think all of us would rather save them before that happens and put money towards the plants and, all the animals. But just being in this 15 years and talking to conservation biologists, the elephants, the whales, the pandas, those are who gets the money. I mean, most of us conservation biologists work for pennies, to be honest. I can tell you right away, my postdoc was considered a well-funded postdoc through San Diego Zoo, and I started at $45,000 a year for 12 years of schooling. We don't do it for the money. We definitely are begging people to, donate and give and be humanists, and to be altruistic, right? But just most people aren't.